So, welcome to TheDustyFeet.com, because this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings, they may be challenged, divine misunderstandings, they may exist in traditional teachings, they just might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So, feel free to journey around the space. Explore. We have many different topics for discussion. Outside the class, Sons of the Father, the Bible Project, Aleph Beta, Follow the Red String, and more. So lend your ear, then lend your voice. Join a conversation, start a conversation, ask questions. Because on this journey, you're probably around folks that just might be pondering the same thing. Community that can build and connect. So come in and join us. And welcome to The Dusty Feet. And good evening. It's April 27th, 2023, and welcome to another of our branches on the vine with our continuing series about how to view the Bible. This is part 7. We'll be discussing biblical narrative setting, right? We'll be using the videos from the Bible Project as our launch point. So we'll continue from there and see where it takes us. Welcome to the Dusty Feet. In the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here in the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. And remember, on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon if you want a reminder. Like we've mentioned each week, we're going to start with addressing these expectations. 1, this is not a definitive, you shall do this. It is, hopefully, a way one might opt to look at things. 2, this is a series, so there will be no one-line answers. Actually, many episodes with different responses and different options. 3, give grace as each person learns more about this wonderful collection of scrolls that we call the Bible. 4, again, this will be a series that builds on itself. So there is an expectation that one would have listened to the previous episodes, keep things in context, because we're building here. 5, through this series, I'll probably have a few points where I have a differing opinion from Tim and John. By no means am I saying that they're wrong, just that I have a differing view on some things. Because honestly, I have nothing but the highest honor and respect for those two and the work that they do with the Bible Project. Also, I want to continue to remind y'all of the podcast from Rabbi David Foreman and the folks at Aleph Beta, right? A book like no other. Because he too is continuing to remind his audience that these are important elements to really grasp in Torah as well. Not really surprised there at all. For those interested in the podcast from the rabbi, that link is in the description below. Okay, So let's continue this journey with the next video, Biblical Narrative, the setting from the Bible Project. Enjoy.
In every story you've ever heard, the action took place somewhere, and that place is called the setting. And since we've been learning how to read biblical narratives, let's talk about how settings work in the Bible.
So, settings are a crucially important tool in the hands of the biblical authors.
Really?
Yeah, think of it this way. When you start a story, everything is new. The plot and the characters are a mystery until things unfold.
Yeah, we have no idea what to expect.
Except, authors can use the setting of a story to prepare you for what's coming.
How so?
Well, let's say a story begins in a courtroom. What do you think is going to happen?
I expect a story about crime and justice.
Yeah, or how about the setting of a dark, old, rundown house?
Oh, something scary is about to happen.
Exactly. So settings evoke memories and emotions because of other stories you know that happened in similar places. The authors know this, and they can use settings to generate expectations about what could happen in this story. And a good author will get creative with settings, and he'll mess with your expectations in order to make a point.
This happens in the Bible?
All over the place. For example, think about the setting Egypt in the Bible.
Yeah, big Middle Eastern empire on the Nile.
Sure. Now think about the first biblical story where someone ends up in Egypt. It's about Abraham. God calls him to journey by faith to a new land, and he promises to give him a huge family. So he sets out, but he arrives during a famine. Now, is he going to trust God and stay in the promised land? Or will he leave the land and go look for food on his own?
Yeah, Abraham leaves and goes down to Egypt.
And there, in Egypt, things go downhill fast. Abraham denies that Sarah is his wife to save his own neck, and then Pharaoh tries to marry her for himself.
Okay, first impression of Egypt, not a great place to visit.
But God then rescues them. He strikes Egypt with plagues, and so Pharaoh relents and sends Abraham away with loads of wealth. So, what do we learn about Egypt as a setting from this story?
It's the place people end up because of stupid decisions, but it's also a place where God comes and rescues his people.
Yep, and the next main story in Egypt follows the same pattern. Abraham's great-grandsons make a bunch of stupid choices, and they eventually lead them to Egypt because of another famine.
Down in Egypt, uh-oh.
So generations pass, and the family ends up as slaves in Egypt, and what do you think's gonna happen?
God's gonna send some plagues and rescue his people.
It's like he saw it coming. After the Israelites get back to the Promised Land, God tells them to never go back to Egypt for any reason. It's the place of trouble and oppression.
So when future biblical characters go to Egypt, I'm supposed to cringe.
Right. Like Solomon, at the peak of his wealth and power, he married the king of Egypt's daughter, and then he started sending Israelites there to import Egyptian stallions. And then, a generation later, that alliance goes bad. Egypt oppresses Israel all over again.
So biblical settings carry with them all these memories of previous stories, which create expectation.
Yeah, it's a brilliant literary device to infuse stories with meaning. Now, biblical authors, they're brilliant. They can build up your expectations, but also creatively mess with them.
Like how?
Egypt's a perfect example. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is born, his family flees to Egypt.
Uh-oh, so this is a problem.
You would think so, but pay attention. Instead of Egypt being the bad place, it's the place of safety. Because who are they fleeing from? King Herod, who is behaving exactly like Pharaoh did, but he rules Jerusalem, not Egypt.
Matthew is messing with me to show how Jerusalem has become Egypt.
Exactly. You can find these kinds of patterns in many different biblical settings. Babylon, Moab, the wilderness, Bethlehem. The list goes on.
Which is a big list.
And it gets bigger, because sometimes the setting isn't just a place on a map. It's a type of situation, but they work the same way that settings do. For example, when people move toward the east, expect trouble. Adam and Eve were banished to the east, and then Cain wanders to the east.
People move to the east to build Babylon.
And all of these narratives are designed to point forward to when the Israelites as a people will be exiled to the east in Babylon.
Ah, nice.
Which leads to one more type of setting in biblical narrative, and that's time, or how long events take. Like, time periods of 40 are often associated with stories where people's faithfulness is tested. Noah in the boat for 40 days and 40 nights. Then he gets off and gets totally drunk. The Israelites got impatient during their 40 days of waiting for Moses on Mount Sinai, so they made the golden calf. Or after the Israelite spies investigate the land for 40 days, the people rebel, so they have to wander in the desert for 40 years.
But then there's the story of Jesus, who was tested in the desert for 40 days, and he reverses the expectation. He overcomes the test.
Exactly. Across the whole Bible, places, situations, and time periods become full of meaning by evoking memories and setting expectations. And the New Testament authors reuse all of these settings to show how Jesus is the one carrying our world from the garden, out of Egypt and the wilderness, and into the new creation.
Okay, so biblical narrative, setting. How important is the setting to you, right? Does it matter that the setting, the original story, might be a context that might be hard to truly appreciate? Maybe we may bring in our own bias because of how we view a setting today. That might not be how those actually living in that setting, how they understood it from their perspective and their experience. Yeah. Remember, there was a good point that Tim and John brought up that a setting can evoke responses based on our own experiences. Yet in these settings, it might be quite possible that they've really not had that experience. Yeah. Remember that the author, that person telling the story, is writing for a short term audience, as in, they're not thinking about the changes that can happen to certain story settings and they need to cover all the bases for the future. Yeah. They are writing to, say, the next generation and the generation after that, right? The rest will have to fall on the storytellers down the road to bring in the context for these story elements. One of our changes that we have typically as Western churchianity experience types is that we often ignore and overlook very real the Jewishness context of a setting or a space, yeah, where they were. Because one of the examples that Tim and John bring up about Abraham, it's a very good point. Yet I think that they might miss some very real experience points, yeah? Yes, God does promise Abraham a land that will belong to his ancestors, that those will be from a lineage that he has not even seen yet because he doesn't have any kids. Next, we have a famine, yeah? And I'm not compelled that the suggestion that Abraham was not trusting God since he left a land of famine to pursue food for him and his flocks. Because we kind of have no real concept, really, of a practical lived in experience of a famine, especially today in modern America, right? Yet there is a generation, and some are still alive, right? From our nation that very much did live with this setting in a contest experience. We have our Dust Bowl area of the 1930s. That was a terrible time in our history. Many were forced to abandon their farms and to migrate to other areas to survive. So, are they not trusting God enough? Yes, I agree. We're not talking about a promise from God about a lineage that not even started yet. We are talking about real lives of folks, many of which were God fearing, that God would provide. It seems the need to migrate is real. Yet, how we act, live, respond, behave in that time, that's the story. So maybe for an upside down view, maybe the testing is not so much about choosing to live in a famine or not live in a famine, but more about how one lives wherever they go on the journey and how you get there. Because settings can change. They often do in Scripture, yet the settings might tell us more about the actions of those in the stories. So in the Abraham story, we have a mixed bag of result with some glaring contrasts that we often don't really address. Because, yes, Abraham does lie to protect his wife. And from the actions of Pharaoh, there was some rationale to his thinking because it did play out that way. Then we have God using plagues to get Pharaoh to release them, and he gives him even more wealth. Confusing, yeah? Yeah, so the context that John gives back to Tim about the Abraham story is his view is more of a backward view. But I'm not compelled by the current story context. So let's postulate a different view of the setting, right? Although, again, it's probably going to be more about the actions of what's happening around the setting than the setting itself in isolation. Famine, death all around. So you need to move to a more fertile land. While there, the fear you had about the need to go there is actually true. The man you think will do something, he actually does it. God still has you in his path. The man that acted the way was dealt with, yeah, he was. God provisions you with more than what you will need for the future from this fertile crescent. Then the next stories involving Egypt are again more about the actions, again, those surrounded in the story, than about Egypt. Joseph, in getting sent to Egypt, the behavior while he's in Egypt, though, that brings credit to God. Because God, through a dream that Pharaoh gives to Joseph to interpret, actually is setting up to bless Egypt immensely just prior to the famine. And Joseph will live the life of a protector and make Egypt a place that survived the famine. And it's a famine that God allows. The children of Israel, they flourish in the land. The setting is the same. Yet over time, it's the characters, the actors, and their circumstances change. Same place, different choices. We go from non-God fearing and maybe going to a bit of God forgetting. Even with Jesus, because it becomes a place of safety and refuge during a horrible and tragic slaughter of innocent lives. So Egypt has a history of being a place of abundance, rescue, flourishing, and safety. What we do see is that those characters, characters we talked about in previous episodes, right? That they are the reasons for the consequences inside of those settings. Because settings are the eye of the beholder in real life and in scripture. The real people in the story, they have a view, and we looking back, we have a view. And you're probably not surprised that I tend to flip stories from our current context. Solomon's Egypt ties. Is that more about the setting of Egypt? Or is that really more about the way that the Egyptians viewed God and the practices that led the people away from God? For one, being given wisdom by God, right? From God, that we see that his choices, even in the land of Israel, can bring Egyptian behavior, right, into the mix. So the setting is where one then makes the choice. So is it the setting or the choice that's the strongest focus? Because settings can very much infuse stories with influence based on possible previous experiences, but the story can change. Expectations can change. I'll share a personal example. As you know, I'm a retired United States Air Force veteran, right? 20 years of my life serving. And I literally traveled all over the globe. During that time, I served under many different commanders. So, the setting was a mix of fixed and fluid. So each of the commanders, they had an office. But the buildings and the locations they changed. However, behavior, I'd say there was a constant expectation in each place for a commander, at least for instance. Um, if you were reporting to a commander officially, you entered the office, stood at the front of his desk, made your introduction, and rendered a salute. So this location, it had so many mixed emotions for me. I'll say mixed. Let me explain, right? Visits to the commander's office were seldom social, right? More often with a purpose. You were either summoned or you had made an appointment to say something. So during my time, I had many visits to the commander's office for many different reasons. So the setting of the office, it did change slightly from base to base, but many constants, yeah? Large desk, flags adorning either side, photos of the current people in power on the walls. Setting, very familiar. Actions of the folks inside on different occasions, very different indeed. Because I got in trouble my fair share of times, all for poor choices on my behalf. Occasionally, I got a chance to get there and stand up for wrong to be righted. And there were occasions for recognition. So my emotions at times were all over the place. So my experiences varied. So much good and so much bad, all in the same setting. So, how would I characterize the setting? How would you characterize your experiences if you were in the military and you were in those settings? Yeah. Because the bias that we have and our personal experience perspective will influence how we share and how we view the story. Because looking back, right, I see so much. But, maybe like the biblical settings of Egypt, might depend on my personal experience to relate it. Looking back, I have a very different perspective of the person on the other side of the desk, right? The choices that they were responsible to make on the behalf of the greater community. Yeah. Joseph, although his experience to get to Egypt, betrayal of his own family, the early years as he moved from slave, right, to next to Pharaoh, probably not the fondest of memories. But the larger majority of his life was one where God had him and he literally saved millions of lives, all in Egypt. Another example, Daniel, land invaded, brought in captivity to a foreign land. Start, like Joseph, bit rough, but he then, like Joseph, lives a long and prosperous life, serving multiple leaders for many years. Both of them, not in what we would maybe say were ideal settings. So, yes, the settings are a scene, but it's the actions of the characters in those scenes to relate the setting to the story. For what it's worth, my take on a commander's office, I guess it's all about why I'm there. That's where God will see what I do to the setting, right? Will it bring disgrace or credit to the United States Air Force? Made it 20 years. I'll leave it for others to decide. Okay. So, our next part in the viewing the biblical narrative will be design patterns, right? What are some of the designs? What are some of the repetitive patterns that are found throughout Scripture? Well, look, like the Dusty Feet, we love patterns. So that should be some fun. Point to ponder. Point to ponder. I want to bring us back to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Famine. very real. Blame them for migrating. Perspective and experience. And thanks for with us tonight on the Dusty Feet.